Flight 824 was delayed by over 2 hours due to a sudden, blinding blizzard that had completely paralyzed the city's airport. I sat alone in the corner of the cold, dimly lit terminal, tightly gripping the straps of my small carry-on bag while trying to calm my racing heart. I was running away from a dark past and a broken life in my hometown, hoping that this late-night flight would finally give me a chance to start over. When the final boarding announcement echoed through the speakers, I took a deep, shaky breath and walked down the jet bridge, completely unaware that I was stepping out of one storm and straight into a much deadlier trap. Inside the airplane cabin, the atmosphere was hauntingly quiet and dim, with most of the passengers already asleep beneath thin blue blankets. I found my row and slid into seat 4B, staring out the window at the heavy snow swirling in the darkness, which mirrored the confusion and chaos of my own life. Moments before the cabin doors closed, a tall, striking man with sharp features and incredibly intense grey eyes sat down in the empty seat right next to me. He wore a heavy black wool coat, and there was an aura of dangerous calm and profound silence surrounding him that instantly made everyone around him hold their breath. The plane lifted off into the midnight sky, but as soon as we cut through the thick layer of storm clouds, violent turbulence began to violently shake the entire aircraft. The sudden drops caused panic to ripple through the dark cabin, and my hands began to tremble uncontrollably as I clutched the armrests in pure terror. Seeing my desperation, the mysterious stranger reached out and gently placed his hand over mine, his voice a deep, soothing baritone as he murmured that it was just a change in air pressure and that I was completely safe. His hand was surprisingly warm against the freezing cold of the cabin, and his steady gaze had a strange, hypnotic effect that instantly quieted my frantic pulse. As the steady hum of the engines filled the quiet cabin, the stranger and I began to talk in hushed whispers, sharing a strange connection under the cover of darkness. I found myself opening up to him, confessing that I was leaving everything behind to escape the deep emotional scars of my past and search for a place where I could breathe freely again. He listened with absolute intensity, his piercing eyes tracking every shift in my expression as if he could feel the exact weight of my soul. He quietly remarked that running away isn't a sign of weakness if it ultimately leads you to the right destination, yet he never revealed his own name, and I didn't dare to ask. When the flight attendants announced that we were only 30 minutes away from our destination, the cabin lights faded into a deep, heavy shadow. The mysterious stranger quietly stood up from his seat and walked toward the restroom at the back of the plane, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a soft smile on my face. I felt a sudden sense of gratitude, thinking that fate had finally sent me a kind soul and a potential protector in the middle of my bleakest hour. I opened my small handbag to retrieve my winter jacket, but the moment my eyes fell into the main compartment, the smile froze instantly on my lips and a wave of pure ice rushed through my veins. Glued flat against the cover of my personal diary inside the bag was a small, crumpled white piece of paper containing a hastily scrawled handwritten message that had definitely not been there before. With trembling fingers, I pulled the note out into the dim reading light, and my breath caught painfully in my throat as I read the terrifying words. The note read, "Do not look back under any circumstance. I am the fugitive killer the police have been hunting across the entire country, and because you sat next to me, they now believe you are my partner in crime." My vision blurred into darkness, and my entire body went completely numb with horror. Fighting the overwhelming urge to scream, I slightly turned my head toward the back of the cabin just as the tall man stepped out of the restroom. The very same handsome face that had brought me comfort just moments ago now looked like the personification of my worst nightmare, his dark eyes locked dead onto mine from across the aisle. He walked back down the narrow row with slow, deliberate steps and calmly slid back into the seat right next to me as if nothing had altered. His terrifying composure made the heavy silence between us feel like a suffocating poison, and I could feel my chest tightening with every breath. Before I could even lean away, he leaned in closer, his strong hand gripping my trembling wrist with a terrifying, iron-like firmness that made escape completely impossible. He brought his lips right to my ear and whispered in a low, deadly serious tone that if I made a single sound or alerted the crew, neither of us would make it off this plane alive. He explained that federal agents had already surrounded the arrival gate because a security camera image of us sitting together had been leaked to the authorities during the flight. He made it chillingly clear that my only chance of survival now was to play along and pretend to be exactly who they thought I was. The plane finally touched down on the rain-slicked runway, and the heavy thud of the tires signaled the beginning of my living nightmare as passengers began retrieving their luggage. He forced me to stand up, keeping his arm firmly anchored around my waist to mimic the posture of a deeply infatuated couple, but I could feel the cold precision of his hidden movements. We walked out into the bright lights of the terminal, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as I saw dozens of armed police officers patrolling the corridors. They were holding high-resolution security printouts, and my soul shattered when I realized the girl in the picture next to him was undeniably me. Just as we approached the final exit doors of the airport, a stern-faced police officer stepped directly into our path and raised his hand to signal us to stop. My breath completely vanished, and a wave of dizziness washed over me as I prepared myself to be tackled, handcuffed, and thrown into a dark prison cell for the rest of my days. However, the man beside me didn't flinch. He calmly looked the officer in the eye and smoothly pulled two pristine, high-quality fake identification cards from his coat pocket. The officer scanned the forged documents, looked back and forth between our faces, and then stepped aside, waving us out into the freezing, storm-ravaged night. The moment we cleared the sliding glass doors, he aggressively pushed me into the backseat of a sleek, black luxury sedan that had been left idling at the curb. He slammed the door, jumped into the driver's seat, and slammed on the gas pedal, sending the car roaring down the abandoned, snow-covered highway at a terrifying speed. I collapsed into tears in the back, screaming at him to tell me where he was taking me and why he had ruined my life by dragging me into his twisted world. He kept his eyes locked on the road ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he quietly replied that he wasn't trying to harm me, but was actually saving my life from the real killers. After hours of driving through the blinding storm, the car finally veered off the main road and came to a halt in front of a secluded, weather-beaten wooden cabin buried deep within a dense, silent forest. He marched me inside the dark structure and immediately locked the heavy deadbolt from the inside, sealing us away from the rest of the world and magnifying my terror. The only source of illumination inside the cabin was a single, flickering amber lamp that cast long, eerie shadows across the wooden walls. Looking around at the old, dusty furniture and the absolute isolation, I felt a crushing despair, realizing I was trapped in a place where no one would ever hear me scream. Despite the lingering tension, he noticed me shivering violently from the cold and quietly tossed a thick, warm woolen blanket over my shoulders before moving to the small kitchen to brew hot coffee. Watching his calm, methodical movements, my mind spun into complete confusion, unable to reconcile his gentle actions with the fact that he was a hunted fugitive. When he walked over and handed me a steaming mug, I knocked it out of his hand in a fit of fear and anger, demanding the truth. Instead of reacting with rage, he sat down directly on the floor in front of me, his piercing grey eyes softening as he revealed that my late father was the key to this entire conspiracy. Hearing my father's name uttered in this forgotten cabin sent a massive shockwave through my entire being, because his sudden death a year ago had been ruled a tragic, unpreventable accident. The stranger explained that both of our fathers had been elite investigative partners who discovered a massive web of corruption involving high-ranking government officials who controlled the city's underbelly. He revealed that their deaths were carefully planned executions, and the powerful men behind the Shadow Syndicate had framed him for murder to permanently bury the truth. Suddenly, the paralyzing fear inside my chest began to morph into a burning, white-hot need for justice. The night grew progressively darker, and the howling wind outside slammed against the cabin walls, but inside, a strange and heavy emotional shift was beginning to take place between us. As I looked closely at his tired face, I no longer saw the cold expression of a merciless killer, but rather the heavy, unbearable grief of a son who had lost everything in the pursuit of truth. For the first time in an entire year, I realized that I wasn't the only one drowning in sorrow and loneliness. In the middle of this dangerous, isolated wilderness, This mysterious fugitive was the only person alive who truly understood my pain and was willing to fight for it. The next morning, a pale beam of sunlight managed to pierce through the dirty cabin window, cutting through the dense chill that had settled over the room overnight. I woke up from a restless sleep and noticed that the stranger was missing from the room, prompting me to quietly slip toward the front door to investigate. Outside, standing knee-deep in the pristine white snow, he was pacing back and forth while speaking into an encrypted satellite phone in an incredibly intense, hushed tone. I listened closely as his voice cracked with emotion, fiercely demanding his contacts to keep me out of the crossfire because I was entirely innocent, and that small act of protection sparked something profound deep within my heart. The moment he stepped back inside the cabin, his face was pale and taut with anxiety, and he urgently told me that our secure location had been compromised by a tracking signal. We barely had enough time to grab our minimal belongings before sprinting out toward the hidden sedan, but just as he threw the car into reverse, the roar of engines echoed through the trees. Two massive, heavily armored black SUVs came tearing down the narrow dirt path, completely blocking our primary escape route and leaving us with nowhere to turn. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, sending the sedan spinning wildly across the ice as he desperately navigated through the dense trees. A sudden, deafening volley of gunfire erupted from the pursuing vehicles, shattering our rear windshield into thousands of tiny, glittering shards that rained down over my back as I ducked onto the floorboards. The stranger kept a death grip on the steering wheel with his left hand while smoothly reaching into the glove compartment with his right to draw a sleek, heavy pistol. He rolled down his window and fired 3 precise, rapid shots into the blinding snow, perfectly striking the front tire of the leading SUV. The massive vehicle veered violently out of control, crashing headfirst into a massive oak tree and giving us a precious few seconds to disappear into the fog. We managed to temporarily lose our pursuers, but our victory was short-lived as the fuel gauge dropped to absolute zero, forcing us to abandon the damaged car on a steep mountain ridge. With the storm picking up again, he took my hand and pulled me into the dark mouth of a deep, hidden cave to seek shelter from the freezing winds. Inside the freezing blackness of the cavern, the cold was entirely unforgiving, forcing us to huddle tightly against each other, our bodies pressed close to share whatever warmth remained. In that suffocating silence, he gently placed his hand over my lips to keep us quiet, his intense gaze promising me that he would protect me until his very last breath. Deep within the absolute isolation of that dark cave, the lingering walls of distrust and terror completely disintegrated, replaced by a raw, overwhelming surge of shared affection. As I carefully tore strips of cloth from my own shirt to bind a deep, bleeding graze on his shoulder from the earlier shootout, he looked at me with an intensity that burned through the cold. He leaned forward and gently kissed away the tears streaming down my freezing cheeks, swearing a solemn oath that once this war was won, he would build a life of peace for us. In that quiet, dangerous moment, our souls became permanently entangled in a bond stronger than any threat. As the first light of dawn filtered into the cave, we both realized that running away would never grant us freedom, and that we needed to strike directly at the heart of the Shadow Syndicate. The stranger revealed that my father had maintained a highly secure, secret safety deposit box at the Central City Bank that contained the final, unedited files of the conspiracy. We knew that returning to the heart of the city was a suicide mission, but we had no other choice if we wanted to survive. We altered our appearances using heavy winter caps, dark coats, and glasses, and walked directly into the crowded lobby of the grand financial institution. The interior of the bank was bustling with morning business, but a suffocating tension hung over us because we could feel the hidden eyes of plainclothes syndicate operatives stationed at every exit. I forced my voice to remain completely steady as I walked up to the high-security counter and presented my father's unique clearance card and legal signature to the head manager. The stranger stood directly behind me like an unyielding shadow, his hand buried deep within his coat pocket, ready to draw his weapon at the slightest sign of a trap. After an agonizingly long delay, the manager quietly nodded and unlocked the heavy iron gate leading to the underground vault. Inside the cold, metallic silence of the private vault room, my hands shook violently as I turned the heavy key inside box number 409, revealing a thick, dust-covered black leather folder. I pulled it out and opened it, finding an absolute mountain of incriminating financial records, forged contracts, and video confessions that definitively proved the innocence of the man standing beside me. I quickly stuffed the priceless files into my bag, but just as we turned around to make our escape, the heavy vault door slammed shut from the outside. Through the reinforced glass window, the corrupt police chief from the airport appeared, a wicked smile spreading across his face as he drew his weapon. The corrupt chief laughed maniacally through the intercom, taunting us with the fact that they had been tracking my father's clearance card from the moment it was scanned at the front desk. Seeing the imminent danger, the stranger didn't hesitate for a single second. He spun around and delivered a powerful kick to a high-pressure fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. The canister ruptured instantly, filling the entire enclosed vault room with a blinding, suffocating cloud of thick white chemical smoke that completely obscured everyone's vision. Multiple gunshots echoed loudly through the chaotic darkness, but the stranger grabbed my hand tightly and dragged me through a hidden ventilation escape hatch. We spilled out into a narrow, filthy alleyway behind the bank building and managed to scramble into the back of a passing taxi, but my relief instantly turned to horror when I looked down at his side. A dark, heavy crimson stain was rapidly spreading across his white shirt where a stray bullet had pierced through his abdomen during the blind shootout in the vault. I completely lost control, sobbing hysterically as I screamed at the driver to take us to the nearest emergency hospital, but the stranger tightly grabbed my hand, forcing me to look at him. He gasped for air, whispering that we couldn't stop now, and that the file had to reach the media first. Summoning a strength I never knew I possessed, I took control of the situation and ordered the driver to accelerate directly toward the headquarters of the country's largest independent television network. I marched into the main broadcast studio with the bleeding stranger leaning heavily against my shoulder, and dumped the contents of the black folder directly onto the lead anchor's desk. Within 3 minutes, the network cut their regular programming to air the explosive evidence live to millions of households across the nation. The entire country watched in absolute shock as the massive web of government corruption was completely exposed, and emergency arrest warrants were issued for the corrupt officials. Within moments of the broadcast ending, the sound of blaring sirens surrounded the television studio, but this time, the arriving police forces were there to protect us rather than hunt us down. I rode in the back of the speeding ambulance alongside the stranger, clutching his freezing hand against my face as the paramedics desperately worked to stabilize his failing vital signs. I cried continuously, begging him to stay alive and refusing to let go of his grip, telling him that he couldn't leave me behind now that my entire existence was completely bound to his. His eyelids fluttered weakly, but he managed to squeeze my hand in return. 2 long, agonizing weeks passed before the heavy white curtains of the intensive care unit were finally pulled back, and I saw his beautiful grey eyes open once again. As his gaze landed on me sitting faithfully by his bedside, a soft, incredibly beautiful smile of absolute relief spread across his pale features, showing he was completely out of danger. The federal courts had reviewed the evidence and officially dropped all false charges against him, restoring his family's honorable name while the real monsters were locked away in maximum security cells. The shadow that had darkened our lives for an entire year was finally gone. A month later, we walked hand in hand out of the hospital doors and made our way back to the exact same airport where our terrifying journey of survival and love had originally begun. But as we walked through the crowded terminal this time, there were no armed guards hunting us, no fake identification cards hidden in our pockets, and no overwhelming fear suffocating our chests. We were completely free, wrapped in the comforting warmth of a peaceful afternoon, and the intense look of adoration in his eyes told me that our futures were finally safe in each other's arms. We boarded the afternoon flight and slid back into our familiar spots in row 4, looking out the clean window at the bright, clear blue sky that lay ahead of us. As the engines roared to life and the plane gracefully lifted off into the heavens, there was no blinding blizzard waiting for us, only the beautiful promise of a brand new dawn. He reached over and gently wiped away a final, lingering tear of joy from my cheek before intertwining his strong fingers tightly with mine. I leaned my head against his solid shoulder, smiling as our dark tale of survival permanently transformed into an eternal, unshakable love. The flight back was supposed to be the beginning of our peaceful life, but as the aircraft reached its cruising altitude, a strange unease washed over me. I looked over at him, his face peaceful against the headrest, but my eyes caught a flickering movement in the reflection of the cabin window. 2 rows behind us, a man in a dark suit was staring directly at the back of our seats, his hand buried suspiciously inside his jacket. My blood ran cold as I realized that while the main politicians had been arrested, the dangerous mercenaries hired by the syndicate were still out there, completely desperate and looking for ultimate blood revenge. I leaned in close to him, my voice trembling as I whispered that we were being watched and that the danger hadn't truly passed. His grey eyes snapped open instantly, the peaceful expression vanishing into the sharp, lethal focus of a protector. He didn't turn around to look, but instead reached down to gently squeeze my hand, silently telling me to remain calm while his mind calculated our options. The cabin pressure suddenly dropped slightly as the plane entered a patch of rough air, and he used that moment of shifting movement to plan a way to neutralize the threat before the flight landed. When the seatbelt sign flashed on due to the increasing turbulence, the suspicious man stood up, pretending to walk toward the restroom but keeping his gaze locked on us. The stranger beside me stood up at the exact same moment, blocking the narrow aisle with his tall frame and forcing the man to stop dead in his tracks. In a split second, before the operative could draw his hidden weapon, my protector grabbed his wrist with an iron grip and slammed him quietly but brutally against the cabin wall. He whispered a deadly warning into the man's ear, disarming him so swiftly and silently that the surrounding sleeping passengers didn't notice a thing. He forced the disarmed mercenary into an empty seat at the back, securing him with heavy plastic ties provided by the alerted flight crew who finally realized what was happening. When he returned to seat 4B, his wound from the previous shootout was bleeding slightly from the physical exertion, sending a wave of panic through my heart. I quickly grabbed a clean napkin from my bag, gently pressing it against his side while tears filled my eyes, hating the fact that he was still bleeding to keep me safe. He looked at me with deep devotion, whispering that 1,000 wounds wouldn't matter as long as I was breathing next to him. The plane finally made an emergency landing at a secured military airfield instead of the main public airport, where federal agents were already waiting on the tarmac. As the cabin doors opened, the mercenary was dragged away in chains, and the commanding officer walked up to us to confirm that the entire shadow organization had been dismantled. Hearing those words, a massive weight that had crushed my soul for an entire year was completely lifted, and I collapsed against his chest, sobbing tears of pure relief. He wrapped his strong arms around me, holding me tightly against the cold wind as the nightmare finally came to an end. 2 months later, the chaos of the trials and the media frenzy had completely faded into the past, leaving us with the quiet freedom we had always craved. We used the inheritance left behind by our fathers to purchase a beautiful, isolated cottage on the coast of a quiet northern island where the air smelled of salt and pine. There were no cameras, no corrupt police officers, and no hidden notes in my handbag anymore, just the steady, peaceful sound of ocean waves crashing against the cliffs. For the first time in my life, I could wake up in the morning without looking over my shoulder in absolute terror. One evening, as a beautiful golden sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, I found him sitting on the wooden porch, holding a small wooden box. He looked up at me, his intense grey eyes now filled with a warmth and softness that I had never seen during our terrifying days on the run. He opened the box to reveal 2 old, worn leather diaries belonging to our fathers, containing their final notes about how much they loved us and wanted us to be safe. We realized that our terrifying encounter on Flight 824 wasn't just a random accident, it was the ultimate fulfillment of our father's final wishes. He stood up and walked over to me, taking both of my hands in his touch sending a familiar, comforting warmth rushing through my entire body. He pulled a simple, elegant silver ring from his pocket, his voice thick with deep emotion as he confessed that he had fallen in love with my bravery from the moment I refused to leave his side in the bleeding ambulance. He asked me to be his wife, not as a captive bound by a dangerous secret identity, but as a completely free woman choosing to share her life with him. I nodded through my joyful tears, allowing him to slide the ring onto my finger. Our wedding day was completely private, with no lavish decorations or high society guests, just the 2 of us standing on the edge of the cliffs under a clear blue sky. I wore a simple white linen dress, and as the gentle sea breeze caught my hair, I looked into the eyes of the man who had once been a terrifying fugitive killer to me. He vowed to spend the rest of his days making up for the sorrow of my past, swearing to be my shield against any storm that life might send our way. When he pulled me in for a deep, passionate kiss, I knew that our souls were bound together for eternity. Now, whenever the winter season returns and the heavy snow begins to fall outside our cozy cottage, we sit by the warm fireplace, sharing a single blanket. We often look at an old, framed airplane ticket stub for seat 4B that hangs prominently on our living room wall, smiling at how a journey born out of pure terror became our salvation. The dark memories of the runaway bride, the corrupt vault, and the bleeding alleys have completely transformed into a distant whisper. In his arms, I found my true home, and our dark tale of psychological suspense officially ended, giving way to an unbreakable, beautiful, and everlasting love story.